Well, I am here happily with Julia Bloch. Hi, Julia.
Hello, hello.
And Max Crandall. Hi, Max.
Hello.
And Larissa Lai.
Hi there.
Hey. Hi. And Max came from Palo Alto or somewhere like that, maybe San Francisco.
Wherever.
Oakland.
Oakland?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I have Stanford on the brain. You commute from Oakland to Stanford.
I do.
Okay, that's a long... Oh, you come down the... Oh, interesting commute. Why are we talking about this? And Larissa came to us from Calgary.
Wahoo. Or should I say Yahoo?
Yahoo. And Julia came from down the block.
Yep.
So we are here to talk about a short prose poem, if it's a prose poem, I think it is, by Caroline Bergvall that's in this book, Meddle English, not Middle English, but Meddle English, Caroline Bergvall. And this piece that we're going to talk about is called About Foam. And I've asked Larissa to read it, and then we'll talk about it.
All right. I'll read it. About foam. A paradoxical pleasure is both solid nor liquid that can be wet, dry, hard, soft, expansive, changeable. An intricate and hollow polymer network is energy transport at its finest, a compound structure of gas nor bubbles nor fans. Once hardened, it can be tough to break. What binds? A gel, for instance, can envelope like an elastic skin. It can be prodded, distorted, pushed about, yet will bounce back and hold its shape. Under greater surface tension, it breaks into liquid, starts to flow. A resilient, responsive substance is mysterious, swift to morph, ever present in all that is cellular, and delivers a shake-up. It supports the many invisible synthetic demands of industry-dependent living, from insulants to binding agents. It has naturally assisted in the solidification of soap, the rising of bread, egg whites, and soufflés since the 17th century. The old Ponce pumice stone works on hard calluses. Once exploded, it can be hard as ash. The skeletal containers of dead sponges were used by Romans for brushes and combs, and for cups. Proust's memory work is foamic in a foam-lined room. A sudden foaming from the mouth, for instance, is the warning of miles of a thick, sluggish matter heaped along coastlines, or bubbling up, obstructing the flow of vast industrial evacuation conduits. Matter turns unwelcoming, seemingly unrecognizable. A persistent reactivity to events in its surroundings acts on a profound imbalance, the sign of a system being worked beyond capacity. Foams everywhere, like the letter E, down to the alveolar structure.
Thank you. Foamic. What is foamic? Let's go around. Let's do a lightning round. Each of us just say what foamic seems to mean here. Julia, you start.
Well, foamic is the adjective form of foam, the verb or noun. Foamic makes me think of something soft and spongy. I mean, it's hard to come up with many adjectives because all the adjectives are already here.
They're
So
already in
I
the
feel like
poem,
I'm being
yeah.
redundant.
So
but
it's neither solid nor liquid.
it feels
It's
like
a special
everything.
state.
It feels almost like everything all at once. Like anything could be foam.
But there are some solid things you would say are not foamic, and there are liquid things you would also say are not foamic. So there's some
It's
things
a
that are in
state.
between.
It's a state of those things, though. I feel like there's so many things can be foam at some moment in time.
Okay, Max, take it from there, please. What is foamic?
I think about foam as movement in that way that it is in between, but you don't know where foam is going to go. And so it also makes me think about what's outside of foam, and then the title, About Foam.
Larissa, help us out.
I think of foam as like an interstitial state. So it's a state between liquid and solid, but also weirdly, it could also be between solid and gas, because foam has bubbles in it. So there's air in it, but then there's the outside of the bubble, which is sort of solid, but it's kind of liquid as well. So foam is weird business. It's interstitial, gooey, slimy stuff makes me think a lot about that movie Alien, with Sigourney Weaver and all of the foam, like the foam and the slime and
That foam
interstitial
is scary and hideous, mostly.
Yeah.
This foam seems to be alluring, at least for the speaker.
Because it's
How'd that happen?
Because it's a feminine substance. So I think it says something about, the whoever like this is Ridley Scott, was Ridley Scott Alien? Anyway, the director's fear of the feminine makes the foam and the slime frightening.
Well, the scariest alien is a mother.
And it's also a mother who is able to fight off the scariest alien. Whereas I think Caroline Bergvall loves foam.
It's clear she loves foam.
She loves it. Foam for Caroline Bergvall is like we were talking outside, but it's this sexy business that, makes things sort of bind together, slip against one another. It's, as Max says, it moves and shifts things. It's this mobile, gooey, transitional material. That's what I think.
So how do we get... There will be some people watching this video and saying, wow, they got really far, really fast from foam to sexuality. And that this is gendered. I mean, it's gendered maybe in a superficial way because a gendered person, Caroline Bergvall, wrote it. But take us through, we got to go through the steps.
One way desire works, maybe, is that you find the erotic where you least expect it. And so here, with a title like About Foam, I expect to be explained to. And what we get, especially at the beginning of the piece, is scientific description, technical writing even. Mm-hmm. And so in order to be seduced by the poem, through reading, one has to be surprised. And I think this poem takes us through a seduction of language that gets us there. That would be one answer.
She's also talking about pleasure, right, in that first sentence, a paradoxical pleasure. And what is a paradoxical pleasure if not sex? Because if it wasn't pleasurable, it would be awful, right? Yeah.
It's a funny grammar there, though, Larissa. Paradoxical pleasure is both solid nor liquid. Okay, so she's really doing what she says. These states are always in transition, and that can be wet, dry, hard, soft, all those things.
But she's also messing with what do you call that part of speech? So she's messing with both and neither nor. Right. She says both nor, which are not supposed to go together.
Clearly deliberate.
It is a paradoxical pleasure to mix up those. What do you call those? Are they conjunctions? What do you call those parts of speech?
Nor is a conjunction.
So, but then both is a conjunction because nor, both. Usually, you say both and, or neither nor.
There's no neither. Yeah.
Because it's both nor, which is just so great grammatically, and the paradoxical pleasure is embedded itself in the language of the poem. Kind of like a bubble in foam.
So we know from the first sentence that these states are going to be spun with a positive value. That is to say, when something is not them, but also them. That's positive, changeable. I think Max was referring to changeability. Okay. That's one thing. But talking about this as sexual pleasure is something else. We who read literarily all the time, it's hard to see a souffle or egg whites or pumice even or foaming at the mouth as not sexual, but that's because we're used to reading these things. So
rising of bread,
bubbling up.
Something warm and yeasty and yielding, but rising. That's all super sensual, bodily, sexual.
I wonder if, I do find this poem quite sexy, but I also wonder if it might actually be better to read it as generative or something, rather than to read it as more sexual. Mm-hmm. To read it as general, thinking about the rising of the bread and there's a lot of growth metaphor. And also, so much of the material of this poem is non-human, it's non-mammalian even.
Yeah.
But it is about this sort of like life-generating movement, slippage, production.
But also friction. Because anything that's changing is causing a certain friction from one state to the other. And friction is associated with physical pleasure. Yes?
I also can't help but think about the synthetic. We get synthetic demands, but these days when I see the word foam, I think about synthetic foam and plastics and polymers. And this poem is about a lot of natural organic materials, but it seems to at least be alluding to the proliferation of synthetic foam, which is very toxic and a kind of crisis in the materiality of our lives.
Yeah, she says it supports many invisible synthetic demands of industry-dependent living, from insulants to binding agents. So there is that. It's not. This isn't purely about organic matter, although there's a lot of organic matter in here.
Yeah.
But it's because it's interstitial. It's like it's about interface movement.
Yeah.
So sure, yeah.
Because something's heaped upon coastline. Coastline sounds very ominous, bubbling up, obstructing the flow of vast industrial evacuation conduits. Matter turns unwelcoming. So it's almost like foam there's nothing inherently natural or unnatural about foam. It's just it's a form. It comes in organic and non-organic kinds.
And it's a form of kind of a somewhat amorphous form that calls out to be understood as changeable, transitional, on its way. When you're reading a book called Meddle English and you come upon a short piece that starts with the word about, you want to say, oh, I better pay close attention because this is where the aesthetic idea for the work is. So not only do we have to read it as a somewhat abstract way of approaching the question of pleasure or sexual pleasure, we also have to approach it as telling us about what the art of this artist cares about. And insofar as it's that, can you do anything with that? Can it be an ars poetica? Can it be a piece of writing that tells us what is preferred in this art? And just because that seems like a stumper of a question, I will introduce another.
Working on an answer.
I will introduce another piece from this book, famous piece called "A Cat in the Throat," and that's about that thing that's in your throat that is very gendered and also very sexual, and is the clearing of the throat that you have to do to make sounds that are not pure, that are not clear, that are full of that friction. One could also clear one's throat and realize that one has spat out French slang, un chat, a pussy. And so the cat in the throat is this thing you want stuck in your throat because you can't make the clearest of statements in order for it to be what the speaker, considers great art. Okay. And at the end of that piece, boy, am I digging myself into a hole here. At the end of that piece, Caroline Bergvall says, to seek this out in the fullness of language, in the connective and lubricated tissue of language. So there's the alveolar structure of the lungs.
And breath.
And breath.
And speech.
Right, which is associated with poetry. To seek this out in the fullness of language, in the connective and lubricated tissues of language and around language, is to speak and work with the cat in the throat. So there is this friction. This is also in this piece, Cat in the Throat. There is this friction inside the speaker's mouth, this friction on the throat. Friction brings awareness and connection and of obstruction, the intake of breath, the raspy sound as one clears one's throat, the spit that wells up, the sound that follows the words that form.
Well, in about foam, it's foams everywhere, like the letter E, down to the alveolar structure. So there's an inevitability or ubiquity to the idea that this form that we've been talking about, this form of foam, is in alveolar, means relating to the lungs and speech and breath, but it also has to do with the tooth socket and the jawbone. It's like it's all here. So
it's a funny word too, because it refers to the little sacs
yeah
in the lung, but it also refers to some dental stuff and some
dental
jaw stuff.
And so it's like hard, bony, structural, but
open like an E,
open
breathy
like an
E.
And it's a cell, and if you think about a cell as something that's open and a container, and it binds with other cells, which I guess is the structure of foam to begin with. It's almost like it's getting atomized here at the end of the poem.
Atomized, yeah.
And I just keep thinking about everywhere, like the letter E. What's that? Like the most frequent letter to appear in any language, or especially French, because it made me think of Oulipo and Perec and the void.
And the letter E as a shape is a kind of foamic shape as well. It's closed on the top, and then there's an open bubble at the bottom that can lead into whatever the next letter is.
It's kind of a mouth too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Before I turned to cat in the throat, I was asking that hard question, which is foamic an aesthetic value, a positive aesthetic value? I think we would agree. Now the question is, how do we make that work? And by the way, I'll just throw in a footnote, which is that Eileen Miles has a piece in a book that not a lot of people read. It's a book that has Iceland in the title. What's it called?
The Importance of Being Iceland.
Yeah. And foam, they did this big speech somewhere about foam. It's like a graduation speech at an art school somewhere. And it's recorded. And they talk about foam in this same way as an aesthetic. So what do we do with that?
That's something that erupts. Isn't there a moment there where she talks about that? The foam erupting. Once exploded. So you think of a volcano and like all the lava with bubbles flowing out. But
so
it can be as hard as
art and writing be that way?
That uprush, that eruption, I think
and
so.
And not some abstract purity that the cat in the throat
pops out of the bubbles, the cat in the throat. Is cat in the throat that kind of like sound, that kind of, or when you're clearing your throat? Is that what she means?
Both of those things. Well, that's the good stuff.
That's the good stuff.
Once you clear the throat, not interested anymore.
Because then it's phlegm.
It's that moment of tension.
I mean, there is what's that?
Like that moment of tension, of the pleasure of tensions.
Yeah.
Huh.
And in this poem, all of the things we just described are all forms about form. This poem is an index.
It's almost like a list, of all the foamic possibilities.
And I read it as a kind of ecstatic poem that builds and builds. And so it's like foam. It starts encompassing everything, like the Romans and Proust. And then when Julia points out the darkness in this poem, I see that the Romans and Proust there are kind of an anti-romantic encompassing. But then there's a way that I wanted to read this when we get to the end as we're almost to revolution itself, or we're almost to chaos itself.
The system being worked beyond capacity.
Wow.
And liberation is the foam everywhere. But now I'm not sure, because it is about collapse. And when you bring up plastics.
Yeah, when I see the word reactivity, I mean, I think about chemical reactions as well that can sometimes produce, increases in volume and bubbles and, foam, explosions,
and
mess.
these are paradoxical pleasures.
They are indeed.
Is unwelcoming supposed to be something we don't want or something we might want? Matter turns unwelcoming, seemingly unrecognizable. I think Caroline Bergvall is seeking the unrecognizable.
Is there pleasure in the surprise of the unrecognizable? But if you can't recognize it, that doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means you don't know what it is.
It's hard to read this piece and see Proust and not want to talk about art. So I'm pushing that.
Well, it makes me think about the poem as a poem about formalism. And this long-standing debate, is a form an empty thing into which you pour the content, or is the form the content itself? And poets are so good at toying with that notion.
Avoiding that question, but maybe she's not avoiding it. Maybe she thinks it's the latter.
I think it's about, look, let's talk about this form, and let's talk about the huge range in which it takes, in which it manifests, or the huge range along which it manifests. I mean, that sudden foaming from the mouth we were reading earlier is a sexual image or a pleasurable image, but it also sounds ominous. It sounds like illness and death.
Like a rabid dog. Don't rabid dogs foam at the mouth?
Yeah.
That's really interesting what you say, Julia, to think about that and to sort of think about the relationship between form and content and the way in which a foam is both, in a sense, because it contains both space and matter.
Yeah,
air and liquidy solid.
And we even get the skeletal containers of dead sponges were used for cups. So it's like an image of a form, which is the form of an image of a container.
Right, yeah.
Which is so cool.
Yeah, that's so cool. And then memory in Proust works like that as well. It's something that bubbles up, right?
Right.
In that famous Madeleine episode where you taste the Madeleine and there's this gush of memory, like a foaming up of...
I want to get into that foam-lined room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a Proustian room that's foam-lined, seems to me there's going to be a lot of memory working there.
Yeah.
But it might be dangerous, so you need the foam or you could hurt yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Can someone describe, and if Caroline is willing, as of this recording, we don't have an audio of this, but Caroline will be willing, I'm sure, and she'll make one. And we will notice then her almost foamic, indeterminate accent, which is Norwegian father, French mother, self-exiled to England, to London a long time ago. And thus an accent that is a little bit Norwegian and a little French, but also kind of Anglo-Saxon. Not modern English, but Meddle English, right? And you'll notice that the way Caroline pronounces the initial H of a letter is You notice that, right?
That's the cat in the throat.
That's the cat in the throat. I mean, she has invented an exophonic accent based on her self-exile from French and Norwegian, and reaches back first to Middle English in Meddle English, and then to Old English in the book Drift, to find an English that is unrecognizable and ancient.
That moves through the same spaces that she has. That's interesting.
And it seems to me foamic is like a primordial linguistic version of that autobiography that I just limbed.
That's great.
Okay, let's do final thoughts on this work that has somewhat defied us. I still think it's in Ars Poetica. All right, Julia, final thought?
Yeah, I'm still puzzled by once exploded, it can be hard as ash. I think of ash as diffuse and slipping through my fingers and soft. It's something you can it's a soft landing. And then I guess probably ash also can be quite condensed and hard. So maybe that's how it's hard. But, we opened this conversation by looking at all the weird, wonderful contradictions in the first line. And that's another contradiction that I just keep dwelling in.
Terrific. Max, final thought?
I found myself thinking about more contemporary interventions with ecology when I read this poem. So I think this poem I thought of it, oh wow, this is a little ahead of its time, or I would want to read it with some queer and feminist science and technology studies. So, and even I was thinking of Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy and these thinkers that look to natural or ecological patterns and models for collectivity, and here for language, which also is collectivized and fractured through collectives. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Can you say that last thing again and expand a little bit on it? Collectivized
it came out like foam.
And fractured.
I just went there. I don't know how it came.
It was a cat in the throat. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not. In the way my initial reading of the poem was a collective one that was troubled by your readings. And so I adjusted my reading based on things you all said, and I think that we can't claim, just like your explanation of Bergvall's own biography, right? We can't claim a universal language.
Right.
It will always be fractured, but in some ways, we have these models of forms.
So I can't help but following up. So language, sort of by definition, at least the way we were taught, is an agreed upon set of rules that a region or a people or a large family or clan agrees, or nation agrees upon, sets up borders around. Poets, and particularly this one, really don't like that. They want the fomic fracturing at the edges of language, so that the collective becomes a negative in this sense, right? Now, I said something that's adjacent
becomes
to
a
it.
risk or unstable. It's always unstable.
Right.
It's always possible.
And even memory, even literary memory, as in Proust, French, even that, especially that, becomes fomic at the edges. You're not supposed to write that way. There's a giant narrative cat in the throat in Proust. I find this really fascinating because, isn't it the case that writers, poets today are really, really interested in that, more interested in that edge than the center of a linguistic agreement?
I've been thinking a lot lately, because of other work that I'm doing, about the birth of the Westphalian state and all of the peoples and ways of being in language that get elided or that just sort of fall away through the production of the state and its reinforcement. I think Max is onto something really, really interesting in terms of thinking about the sociality of language and the impossibility of, making a pact with one another, that when we speak in a certain way, you speak a certain word in a certain way, it's going to mean something, against all of the possibilities of movement that make language slip, and how those are enforced through, for the last couple of centuries, state power, and what happens when you start to kind of try to break those down. I love this idea that it's also ecological, and that it enters into the non-human. I think that's what you're getting at. Is that what you were? Which is so amazing, because because it would make sense in relation to all of this organic. I was going to say matter, but it's also not antimatter. Yeah,
It's biochemical, and whatever is not biochemical but is still biochemical.
and it's also full of space. So spaces that can, that call to you to kind of go in. That are the attractants that pull you in.
This is a catalog of conditions that gave rise to life. All that slimy, fomic stuff, right? So, but at the same time, addressed to the question of language, how human language starts to recreate the origin.
It makes me think of, there's this really great book, critical book called Climate Lyricism that I was looking at the other day, and the author's last name is Song, S-O-N-G, and makes the argument that, non-human elements are doing the work of lyricism in a lot of contemporary work like this.
Cool. I check that out.
That's interesting. Okay, my final thoughts. I have two. One is very quick. It's just that there's a line in here that I wanted to get in the record. The old Ponce pumice stone works on hard calluses. And that really says what this piece is trying to say overall, which is that something that is made of air bubbles, it's essentially almost a non-thing, pumice, can soften a hardness. So this is, I think, a very radical approach to thinginess.
Yeah.
And doesn't pumice come from volcanic action?
Yeah,
Like, is
it's
it-
it's alveolar. It's coral.
And it's rigid, but it's very lightweight.
But something about that airiness in this hard thing softens calluses. And I think of hard calluses as that's what you get for being such a hard ass, for like pummeling your body
Putting
or whatever.
on your tight shoes and walking
Yeah,
too
like
much
what the
around
hell?
them.
And so, but I've got this non-state material that's not quite material, and I can soften you. And I just think that's like perfect for what she's trying to do. And my second thought is just sort of it's kind of a modpo thing, kind of a basic thing about how marvelous poets can be. This thing is functioning. Oh, is it two levels? On the one level, content. We wrestled with it. It seems to be a list, as Max was saying, of everything you think about, facts and things associated with this thing, foam, this non-thing thing. It is clearly that. It is also crying out to be read in a meta-poetic way. Isn't this the way we want our language or the way we want our art? Thank you, Julia, so much, Max. And Larissa, thank you.